Welcome to Emerging Post-Pandemic, Being a Future-Focused Leader Now. I am Trista Harris. I'll be your speaker today, and I am a philanthropic futurist. And I bet a lot of you haven't ever met a philanthropic futurist before, so I'll describe how I got here. A little while back, I was running a community foundation. It was my first time running a foundation, and I had a little Post-it note on my computer that said, "Learn how endowments work." Because I was responsible for our endowment, I had no idea how it works. So a couple months into the job, the stock market collapsed, and suddenly our endowment had lost 30 to 50% of its value. That is not a great place to be in as a foundation leader, to suddenly not have dollars to give away. And so we were in a big crisis. And we knew that we had to support our grantees because there were really difficult conditions that they were facing externally, and we wanted to be there for them, but we didn't have the dollars. And so at that same time, my son, who is a big teenager now, was just a little toddler, and he wanted to go to a bookstore. I'm based in Minneapolis, and there's a bookstore here that is just full of animals. There are chickens and rabbits and all of these little animals kind of running around. And of course, it's like a child's paradise. And so he didn't want to leave. We were there for hours and hours. And they had one of those like teeny little chairs like you sit in when you're at a kid's school conference. And in that corner, parents that had been in the bookstore before had sort of left behind books for the other parents that were trapped there for many, many hours. And one of those books was called Flash Forward. And it was about how businesses could use the tools of futurism to be really successful during times of big transformation, which is what we were living in 2008. And so I read this book front to back, and at the end realized that futurism was actually a really critical tool that we needed in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors to get through this really difficult time. And so I brought those tools back to my organization and to our grantees, and it was completely transformational. So in that next year, our grantees had 10 legislative wins, the most in our organization's history, including on things like marriage equity. And we had the first homeowners bill of rights in the entire country. And that happened because we were using these futurism tools that I'm going to share with you today. What I realized is that it was important for me to learn as much as I could about these tools and share it with people like you that do good for a living. And so this sent me on this journey where I interviewed dozens and dozens of experts in fields like human genome mapping and disaster first response, asteroid mining. Who knew that was a thing that people are working on? And in that process, tried to figure out how those futurism tools could be transferred to people that work in our sector. So it has really led me down this path of starting my company, Future Good, where I work all the time helping foundations and nonprofits build a more beautiful and more equitable future. So all the lessons that I've learned are in my book, Future Good. You can get a free copy. I'm giving electronic copies away during the pandemic. You can get that at tristaharris.org. There's a little pop-up that'll show up, and if you just put your email address, you can download your copy. I think that these are the absolute tools that we need during this time of big transformation, because we can't just react as change happens. We have to be able to both predict and shape the future. So we are in a pandemic moment. It's an in-between time where our old ways of living are gone, but we're not yet sure what the new is going to look like. And that is a really frustrating time for humans that love consistency and linear change and sort of understanding what's going to happen next. It's also an amazing time to build what the new is going to look like. And I know many of you are seeing that within your organizations, that you've been able to create big transformation and change in a short period of time, because we're living in a time where everything is just a lot fuzzier and flexible. I've been holding really tight to the idea of a caterpillar. So as it goes into the cocoon, it literally like liquefies. All of its cells get squished together. It's probably really terrifying for the caterpillar because you're not sure what that next phase is going to look like. but it is through that transformation that something beautiful comes. And I am so, so helpful that after this pandemic, we are going to have a transformation into something much more beautiful. We're also living in a movement moment. Like a pandemic was not enough. We are in a time of racial transformation, and foundations and nonprofits that are not using a very explicit equity frame and a very explicit racial equity frame in their work may be unintentionally exacerbating disparities every single day, because we have a lot of systems that we interact with that are great at creating inequality. And so it is our role to understand what our part is in the systemic inequality and address it within our institutions so that it can change what our world looks like. It is sometimes hard to move forward when you're trying to change things in the social sector. But if you harness this outside pressure and change that's happening in this movement moment, you can actually move change forward a lot faster than you'd ever expect. So today, what I'm going to teach you is a very simple 3-step process that I've developed to help you become more future focused in your work. People often say the future is way too complicated for you to understand. Often you hear that from futurists that are being hired to tell you what the future looks like. It really is not difficult. It is a simple 3-step process that if you implement consistently, it's going to help you understand how to both predict what the future looks like and shape what that future looks like. So the first step is stop. This is stop loving the problem. I don't know how much time you spend in meetings where you are absolutely loving the problem. You are talking about it and looking at it from all different angles and really spending all your energy talking about how terrible things are. Sometimes we do this externally where we talk about the conditions and the communities that we're working on. We are really trying to create a picture of there are big issues and we need funding to fix it. Sometimes we do this when we talk about our internal processes. So as we think about a new database or a financial system, we could spend a lot of time just talking about what isn't working. And of course, it is critical to understand the scope of the problems that you're working on. I'm not saying that that isn't important, but if you use all of your energy describing what's broken, there's nothing left to figure out how to fix it. And so I think it is really important for us to stop making the problem the guest of honor when we host meetings. Don't have a meeting where the full purpose is to talk about what's broken. I think the other thing that we can do is check our communications and how we talk about the issues that we're working on. Can we talk about what we're building instead of what's broken? Can we talk about our ideal future, what it would look like if the problems in either the community or in our organization were completely solved? What is that ideal future that we're working towards? As opposed to spending all of our time and energy talking about those things that are broken. I think it's really important to start at that point of what we're working towards. So what do we want it to look like? What does it look like if we're fully fixing problems? And then work backwards to figure out what it takes to get there. I think often in the social sector, we spend a lot of time loving and describing those problems. But if you ask the staff in your organization, what would it look like if the problems that we're working on are completely fixed? You might get 100 different answers. And so let's get really clear on the direction that we're going so that we can all be aligned and make sure that our efforts are going the same direction. The next step is look. You can't just be flexible when change comes. You need to anticipate that change and prepare for it before it happens. We are living in a time of rapid change. And I know in your roles in organizations, you may feel like you're sort of getting pushed on the ropes as you're dealing with sort of crisis after crisis after crisis. It's important to get ahead of what that change might look like. So how do you do this? You need to make time for the signs of what the future is going to look like that exist right here in this moment. There's the saying, the future is already here, it just isn't evenly distributed. And so how do you find those signals about what's next? There's a lot of different ways to do that. I think the most important is to make time for the future in your present. So I encourage people to spend 5% of their time on future thinking. This is just a couple hours a week. I like to do it Friday afternoons when it's a little bit quieter. For us in Minnesota in the summertime, people are leaving to go to the lake, so offices are a lot quieter. Any chunk of time where you can just really dig deep and think. And during that time, you can do a couple things. One, if you are subscribed to the newsletters of future focused organizations in your field, who's doing really great work, who is like so far ahead of everybody else, pay attention to what that organization is doing. And if they're sending you newsletters, just put it in a folder. And then during that time, read and start to understand what they're working on. Somebody sends you an interesting article about a future trend in your field that you're working in, put it in that folder. And then during that time, sort of read and pay attention. The other thing that I like to do is I set Google alerts. So obviously this is my full-time job, so I'm paying attention to the future a lot, but for issues that you're concerned about, set a Google alert. I have Google alerts for things like the future of rural communities, the future of nonprofits, the future of philanthropy, future of self-driving cars, different things that are tied to your organization's work or your internal operations. Just do future of and that word, and you're going to get a kind of constant stream of information. Put it in that folder during that time, read those articles, and then you can keep a notebook. It can be a physical notebook if you're old school and you like to write things down. Write notes about what you're noticing in those trends. I do it in an electronic notebook through Evernote, because I can put labels and it's easier for me to search for things and all that good stuff. But I will clip an article, and then I'll write underneath it, here's what I think this means for my organization, or here's what it might mean for foundations or for nonprofits, so that I'm constantly interacting with these future ideas. And then what starts to happen is you're just out sort of doing your day-to-day and you notice something, you go, oh, I wonder if that's tied to that other thing that I was watching before. And that building that future muscle really creates the space where suddenly you're starting to predict and understand what's going to happen next. So I'm going to give you some of the trends that I've been noticing that I think are going to be important to your work moving forward. I love this quote, today is giving you clues about tomorrow. There are really those signals of the future that are showing up all over the place, and it's our job to really make meaning out of those things that we're noticing. So the first one is equity frame or apparel. So foundations and nonprofits that don't use an equity frame for their work are exacerbating disparities like we talked about before. This happens because resources flow to the easiest place. So if I'm at a foundation and I'm giving dollars to, let's say, a school district, they are going to make sure that they're going to have positive results because they want to report back, we did a great job. And they're probably not going to use an equity frame for that investment if that wasn't the explicit understanding before we started. And so what you want to do is, and then those investments make those gaps larger and larger and larger because more investments are going to the easiest to reach. So as you're thinking about your work, think about the equity frame that you can add on top of it to make sure that you aren't unintentionally exacerbating those disparities. The next is that our futures are connected. So the pandemic has brought to light what has always existed, that we are only as safe and as healthy as the most marginalized person in our community. Now, nothing makes that more obvious than a pandemic that's passed from person to person. But it's a time for organizations to start to think about what their roles are to support those that are most marginalized. During a pandemic, we had a ton of people losing jobs, and health insurance is tied to jobs. It doesn't make a ton of sense to have people be less able to be healthy during a time of a global disease. And so we have to start to think about what things like universal healthcare looks like. How do we make sure that everybody in society is covered? And within our own organizations, who are your staff that are most marginalized or most likely to sort of fall into those cracks? And what are the ways that you're filling those gaps? So is your organization paying a living wage to every single staff person? What does health coverage look like for your staff? And are staff able to afford that health coverage for their families? This is one of those things where if we all live together, it's a lot easier. But we need to figure it out because we are connected in this way that is clearer than it's ever been. The next is remote work, which, obviously we are sitting here today in this remote conference. We have all been participating in the largest remote work experiment that our world has ever seen. If we were more gentle with ourselves, we would say that we've been sheltering in place during a pandemic and trying to get some work done. But what we've really figured out during this time is a lot of the stuff that we were positive had to happen in person really doesn't have to happen in person. And all the things that we thought we had to have meetings about, you really could do those things in an email. And we've gotten a lot more efficient as we're doing this work. And so as the world starts to open back up, we're moving to a place where a lot of workers are saying that they would like to remain either fully or partially remote. And a lot have said that they'll leave their organizations if they are not able to remain remote. And so this is a sort of pending crisis that we're seeing in this field where there's going to be a lot of transition amongst organizations as people are trying to figure out who's the best culture fit for who I am in this unique moment. I was helping a client organization do some visioning about what the future of work looks like in their organization. And what I heard from one of their staff people is, my ideal future after this pandemic is that I can be as good of a parent and as an engaged of a parent and a neighbor and a community member as I was during the pandemic. And so I think there is a sort of pending feeling of loss that people are anticipating as we start to talk about what it means to open up organizations. How do we make sure that we balance those two things? Because your employees are not the same people that they were a year ago. They've learned a lot about themselves. They've learned a lot about their families and their communities and what's important and where they need to spend time. And if we can harness that transformation, it can be really powerful and wonderful for our organizations. The next is new impact tools. I think it is critical for social sector organizations to make sure that they are aligning all of their efforts and all of their resources to move their mission forward. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, but I think on the finance side, making sure that your dollars, the way that they're invested and the way that they're spent is aligned with your mission is really job number one for us in this sector. And we have not had that conversation as often as we need to. So as you look at your vendor policies, if you're an economic justice organization that's based in Ohio, are you prioritizing spending dollars in Ohio? Are you prioritizing spending money with women-owned and people of color-owned vendors? How are you making sure that the ways that you're spending dollars really aligns with that mission? And I think when we all start to do that consistently, it's going to be transformational in our communities. The next is debt as an impact tool. So this is Darren Walker, who leads the Ford Foundation. Ford was the first foundation in our history to offer a social impact bond. So what they did is they sort of got money loaned to them based on their endowment value, used those dollars to be able to significantly increase their grant making during this time of great societal stress. It has really changed the conversation about what's possible and what dollars are available to support our sector. And so we've always sort of acted like there is a very limited pie of dollars that are available. I think the pie is bigger and more complicated than we ever could have expected. And as we have these new innovations that are bringing in new dollars to the field, what does that mean? How does that change our fundraising? How does that change what's possible in our work? More foundations are doing loans to nonprofit organizations. How do you harness those dollars to create greater change in your community and move your mission forward? So the very last step is go. We need to learn how to fail faster as a field. I know that that is counterintuitive, and your organizations have really important missions that are creating big difference in the world. And so it feels like, oh, it's sort of dangerous to say we're going to fail, because if you fail, does that mean that we are failing families? Are we failing communities? And so we're sort of careful to make sure that we don't fail. But I would very gently say, I think we're actually failing our communities and families just very, very slowly. So the world is, and conditions are getting worse and worse, and we are not making them better at the same rate. And so our families and communities are really feeling that. And so it is only through innovation and trying new things. So things that you've learned about in the look step, new innovations, new ways of doing work, try those out. Bring those innovations into your organization. It doesn't have to mean forever. You can do a test or a trial for 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, see how it works, figure out what you've learned, and then try something new. So I think we have become really risk averse in our field, and we actually have the space and the mission to push a lot harder than a lot of other sectors have. And I think we need to live up to that. So in this step, it is really about trying new things and then telling the field what you've learned, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The ugly is the important part, and that is what we usually don't want to talk about, but that's where the most learning happens. So if your organization has hit its head trying something and it really didn't work, tell other people so that they don't hit their head in the same place. And I think we need to start to build that skill and muscle in the field where we talk about what doesn't work and mistakes that we've made and what we're doing to try to fix that so that we can all get better in the process. So we're going to have a Q&A at the end of this session. So if you have questions, I'd love if you could stick that in the chat so that we can address those as we move forward. We'll have plenty of time. I'd love to hear if you have questions or disagreements or see other trends than the ones that I've listed. If you have questions about how you can be a more future-focused leader, or if you have questions about the future of whatever issue you work on. I really pride myself on being a generalist that learns about a lot of things that will impact both nonprofits and foundations. And so put those questions on the chat. I'd love to address those. The last piece that I'd love to leave you with is the best way to predict your future is to create it. The future does not happen to us. It is the result of the decisions that we make today, and we have the opportunity to determine, do we have a Star Trek future or do we have a Hunger Games future? And we really need to jump into this space where we believe that a more beautiful and more equitable future is possible, and that we're willing to do the work that's necessary today for us as individuals, where we become future-focused leaders, and within our organizations where we're setting really big goals about our ideal future and what's possible so that that transformation happens. If you would like to stay in touch, or if you want to learn about trends that I'm noticing in the field, you can check me out at tristaharris.org. That's also the place that you can go to get your free copy of the Future Good book. Thank you for all that you do to build a better future. You are transforming the world every single day with your work, and I appreciate all that you do. Thanks so much for having me come today.